What's the perfect camera setting for wildlife photography? The truth is, there isn't one. Every wildlife situation is different, which means that your camera settings should be too. In this video, I'll show you the few camera settings that really matter and how to choose them depending on the situation. The problem is that many beginners don't choose their camera settings with confidence. They end up switching settings back and forth, and decisions become random. So instead of guessing, let's break it down properly, starting with shutter speed. Shutter speed determines whether motion appears blurred or frozen in your photo. And one of the most common mistakes is simply not adjusting your shutter speed for the situation. When I took my first wildlife photos, I had a high shutter speed all the time to minimize motion blur. But I didn't consider how that affected the rest of my camera settings. But we'll get to that in a moment. A walking deer is fairly easy to freeze with a slower shutter speed. A running rabbit, however, is much more demanding, and birds in flight often require the fastest shutter speeds you'll use. The simple rule is, the faster your subject moves, the faster your shutter speed needs to be. Also keep in mind that smaller birds, for example, fly much faster and more unpredictably than bigger birds. So you'll need a faster shutter speed to freeze the action. Later in the video, we will actually take a look at some photos and settings together, so you see how the settings change depending on the situation. But of course, not every situation requires a fast shutter speed. And animal movement isn't the only source of motion blur. You have to consider your camera movements as well. And that's where the reciprocal rule comes in. It states that your shutter speed should be at least the inverse of your focal length. This is a simple guideline to help you prevent blur caused by camera shake when shooting handheld. By using a tripod, however, you have a lot more flexibility because camera shake isn't a concern anymore. If you're unsure how the situation will unfold and you have enough light, I would usually recommend going for a higher shutter speed. Why? We'll find that out in the next chapter. Now you've chosen the correct shutter speed, but the exposure doesn't seem right anymore. Your photo is too bright or too dark. What do? That's where the exposure triangle comes in. Shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. All of these settings are connected. So if you change one of them, at least one of the others have to change as well to maintain the correct exposure. Let's say you've increased your shutter speed to capture a bird in flight. Your photo suddenly becomes darker. So how do you get that light back? You have two options. You can open your aperture, or you can increase your ISO. Opening your aperture lets more light reach your sensor, but it also decreases your depth of field. Closing the aperture gives you more depth of field, but also lets in less light. And this is where it becomes a balancing act. A very wide aperture can sometimes give you too little depth of field. If your subject is facing you directly, you might end up with a sharp nose, while the rest of the face is already out of focus. And if there are multiple animals in the frame, only the one you focus on may be sharp, even if you wanted the others to be in focus as well. Your second option is increasing the ISO. ISO controls how sensitive your camera is to light. Increasing it brightens your image, but it also introduces noise. And that's where many photographers still hesitate. Years ago, avoiding high ISO was actually a very good advice. But modern cameras and today's denoising programs handle high ISO much better. So in many situations, I much rather increase my ISO than lower my shutter speed, because noise can usually be reduced later. Motion blur, when the shutter speed was too slow, usually can't. Now we've got exposure under control. But what if the camera focuses on the wrong thing? because even a correctly exposed photo is useless if it's not sharp where it matters. And that brings us to autofocus. The next mistake is thinking that autofocus will handle everything automatically. In reality, autofocus is a tool. You still need to guide it. In wildlife photography, AFC or continuous autofocus is the one you will usually use the most. Unlike AFS, it continuously adjusts the focus as your subject moves. The next thing to think about is your focus area. This tells your camera where to look. There isn't one focus area that is always best. In an open field, a large focus area usually works pretty well. But if you're shooting through branches or grass, it can easily lock onto something in the foreground instead of your subject. In those situations, switching to a smaller focus area gives you much more control over what the camera focuses on. If your camera supports it, animal and eye detection can be very helpful as well. In wildlife photography, sharp eyes are everything, because our eyes are naturally drawn to the eyes of an animal first. So your goal with autofocus is simple. Don't just rely on your camera. Guide it. Choose the right mode, choose the right focus area, and whenever possible, use animal or eye detection. So even with perfect focus, how do you capture the perfect moment? Because wildlife photography isn't just about sharpness, it's also about the timing. And that's where the shooting mode makes the difference. Let's start with single shot mode. In single shot mode, the camera takes one image every time you press the shutter. This works when the subject is completely still or when you want to be very intentional with each frame. But in wildlife photography, moments change fast. And that's where burst mode comes in. Burst mode allows you to take multiple photos in a short sequence while holding down the shutter. This is especially useful for fast movement, like a bird taking off, an animal running, or unpredictable action. First of all, it helps you capture the perfect pose. Whether it's a bird with fully spread wings or a deer looking directly into the camera. But it also increases your chances of getting one perfectly sharp photo, especially when you're shooting at slightly slower shutter speeds. I'll show you an example in just a minute. Alright, understanding the settings is one thing, but the real question is, what does that look like in real wildlife situations? Let's go through a few examples and break down the settings together. There are no perfect settings for wildlife photography. Every situation is different, and that's exactly why there isn't a single setting that always works. So instead of just copying these numbers, try to understand why I chose them. Let's look at a few examples. Let's start with this gray heron. It was a rainy and overcast day, so light wasn't exactly great. But luckily, this heron was standing almost completely still, so I didn't need a high shutter speed. I used 1/640th of a second, roughly following the reciprocal rule for my focal length. That shutter speed was fast enough to keep the bird sharp while still allowing the falling raindrops to slightly blur, which adds to the atmosphere. One thing to watch out for is that raised foot. That could be a sign that the heron is about to move, so keep your shutter speed in mind. This robin was photographed deep inside a forest where light was extremely limited. At 1/640th of a second, my camera wanted to use an ISO of 12,800, which was something I was not really happy with. That robin, however, was not going anywhere. And from experience, I know that robins often stay on the same perch for a long time before taking off. So I decided to try something a little risky. I dropped my shutter speed all the way down to 1/60th of a second while shooting in burst mode. At 600 millimeters handheld, that shutter speed is pretty crazy. And to be honest, most of the photos were completely useless. But one single photo turned out sharp, and that's all I needed. Now let's move on to more dynamic situations. For this red kite, I used 1/2000th of a second, which is usually pretty good for bigger birds in flight. But this wasn't a normal flight. The kite had just caught a mouse and was taken off from the ground, so its wing movements were much more powerful. You can actually see that the wing tips are still slightly blurred. If I wanted to freeze every feather perfectly, I would have needed an even faster shutter speed. But I don't think that's necessary, because the face is sharp and I think the photo turned out great. A few seconds later, I photographed it again, but this time the bird was flying more steadily. The shutter speed has stayed exactly the same, but the wingtips are slightly sharper. One thing that did change though was the ISO. It went up to 1000, most likely because the light had slightly shifted. And that's one of the reasons why I like to use Auto ISO. It allows me to focus entirely on following the bird instead of constantly adjusting my exposure. This photo was probably the most challenging one of this video. Western house martins are incredibly fast and unpredictable. They constantly change direction mid-flight. To have any realistic chance of freezing them, I used 1/4000th of a second. But even then, keeping them in frame was extremely difficult. I often didn't even have time to lock focus on them before they were gone again. But now compare that to this barn swallow. They're just as fast. But this time I combined burst mode with panning, meaning I tried to follow the bird smoothly with my camera while shooting. That's why the sand below is actually a little bit blurry. Because of that, I was able to get a sharp photo at 1/2500th of a second instead of 1/4000th. This shows, once again, that there are no perfect settings. You have to change your settings depending on the situation. And that's it. Hopefully you now have a better understanding of how to choose your camera settings instead of just guessing them in the field. Camera settings are only one part of becoming a better wildlife photographer. If you're just getting started, I also made a video about 5 things I wish I had known before I started wildlife photography. It covers some of the biggest lessons I've learned and helps you avoid a lot of frustration. You can watch the video right here. And as always, thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.